Well, hello and welcome to another edition of In the Trenches podcast. I'm your host, Seth, and today we have a very special guest who has been on this program a few times, and his name is Stephen F. Hayward. He is a resident scholar at UC Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies and a visiting lecturer at Berkeley Law. He was previously the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy, and is the author of 6 books, including The Age of Reagan, The Fall of the Old Liberal Order, 1964 through 1980, The Age of Reagan, The Conservative Counter-Revolution, and Patriotism is Not Enough, Harry Jaffa, Walter Burns, and the Arguments that Redefine American Conservatism. We will be talking about his newest book, which I had the pleasure of reading, an advanced copy, called M. Stanton Evans, Conservative Wit, Apostle of Freedom. Steve, glad to have you back on.
Well, it's great to be back with you, Seth. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's been very busy. Where I live in Oregon, I'm working on a campaign, so it's been kind of crazy. But as they say, the show must go on, right?
Right. That's right.
Well, before we start about your book, there's been some big news that's come out of Twitter today about, it sounds like Elon Musk may be, buying Twitter after all. And you wrote you had a great meme this morning on there and on Twitter, and then I think you also put it on Facebook too as well. But I wanted your thoughts about Elon Musk getting Twitter before we get started.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely surprised about this. It's very hard for a company like Twitter to do the poison pill stratagems they're trying to do to stop Musk, because Musk was offering quite a premium to the current stock value, and the board of directors of Twitter were vulnerable to a big shareholder lawsuit if they just said no. That's a little different from a little bit of history on this. The poison pills, which are artificial restrictions on stock voting rights and things like that, those were designed back in the 80s when you had corporate raiders, and those were people who would take a position in a company to try and blackmail them to pay them off, really. And so poison pills made some sense in those days because they could arguably protect shareholder interests. But in this case, Musk is offering to buy the whole company. And so I was going to say the board of directors was very vulnerable to shareholder litigation if they simply said no. Now, the next question is what's the old joke of what are you going to do with the Holy Grail once you found it? We'll see how Musk manages the problem of Twitter. Of course, Twitter's been awful ideologically and otherwise, but content moderation, I don't really think we want a complete free for all where anybody can post anything, because you will get some really awful stuff there. Including, you can find pornography on Twitter if you look for it. They don't really screen that out at all, unlike Facebook, which does quite vigorously. So we'll see, but we'll see what Musk does. I don't think he wants to spend all his time micromanaging how this is done, but it's overdue for a shakeup. So it's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, Twitter definitely is overdue for a shakeup. I agree with that, and it's lovely to see. I mean, I'm not the usual crying liberal tears and stuff, that sort of thing that Ben Shapiro and all of them do. But it's nice to see the left kind of lose their mind over this, and it just shows, that they're really afraid of what Elon Musk could do.
Yeah, so look, I don't know. It's kind of a question mark whether Musk is truly, libertarian or is moving to the right. I think he's figured out where the opportunities are to annoy people. But I think you're right. The reaction to this, and this is just one example of many, is that it shows us once again how insecure the left is. Intellectually insecure. This partly explains their drive for cancel culture. They simply will not be challenged because I think in a lot of cases they know that they're going to lose an argument, right? I always say that you get called racist. When you get called a racist, it means you're about to win an argument with a leftist. And so, same with Twitter's. Oh my God, this is terrible. So we'll see if there's a run for the exits from the woke staff at Twitter, and that'll be fun to watch too.
Well, I predict, it'd be a little bit like all those leftist celebrities whenever a Republican wins, the presidency and they're all like, I'm leaving the country. And then, of course, a few months later, they're still living in California in the United States. They haven't left the country. I think the same thing's going to happen here.
Yeah. Alec Baldwin could have saved himself a whole lot of legal trouble right now if he'd followed up his promise to move to Canada when George W. Bush was reelected in 2004, but he didn't. So there you go.
That's a good point.
Michael Moore, same thing, right?
Exactly. Well, let's get into a little bit of your book. The first question is that I wanted to ask you is just tell us a little bit about M. Stanton Evans and why you believe he deserved a biography.
Yeah, I'll do it, I guess, in reverse order. Although he only died 7 years ago, he's already been forgotten by a lot of people who ought to know better. I mean, middle-aged people who were alive when Stan was still around and writing and doing things. He was a really important figure in the modern conservative movement in several ways simultaneously from, the late 50s or certainly the 60s into the 1990s. And in fact, his last a few books were published around 2010. So he was active for a very long time for three things. One, as a journalist, he was important to conservative media back when there weren't many conservative journalists. Second, he was an honest-to-God first-rank thinker. And in fact, if he'd been an academic, I think he would have become one of the preeminent intellectuals of conservative academia, like Eric Vogelin, who we liked, or Milton Friedman, or even Ludwig von Mises. Stan did 1 year of graduate study with Ludwig von Mises back in the 50s. And then finally, he was politically active. He was the chairman of the American Conservative Union in the 1970s, which is when that organization really came into its own as an important player in conservative politics and national politics. And behind the scenes, he was always mixed up with political organizing. So that's quite a hat trick, you might say, if I've got the hockey metaphor right. Journalist, thinker, and activist. That's a rare to see those three things in one person.
And how did you come to know M. Stanton Evans? Because you don't really get into it in the book. You kind of stray a little bit from your relationship with him, but I kind of want to bring it out just a little bit.
Sure.
Yours, So yeah, tell us about that.
Right. Well, yeah, I didn't want to insert myself into the story much at all. Just a couple little places it comes out. He was my first mentor right out of college. In college, I thought I wanted to be a journalist or a writer or something like that, which is, pretty much what I ended up doing. And when I got out of college in 1980, I saw the ad that Evans, who I was familiar with his work and his radio commentaries, that he had started this program for young journalists at the National Journalism Center, it was called. And so I applied and was accepted. And, the rest is history, as they say. I mentioned that at the very beginning of the book, although I shoved myself off stage as fast as possible to concentrate solely on Stan. But he was a remarkable mentor in several ways. Narrowly speaking, professionally, he taught the craft of journalism quite well and quite differently from what you'll get at a journalism school. And then second, personally, he's quite an influence. I don't want to say inspiration. He wouldn't like that term, but he was, to my surprise, for this Yale-educated, somewhat famous person at the time, very approachable, very casual, very friendly. Unless he was on a deadline, he'd always have time to chat with you if you walked into his office when the door was open. He loved going out at the end of the day with the interns and younger staff, and having a few drinks, going to a rock and roll trivia contest in a bar, things like that. So he was just a ton of fun to be around. And you just picked up a lot of wisdom just hanging around with someone like that.
In the book, which I loved, this book is very accessible, a breeze to read. I loved reading it and how you wrote it. But what I loved the most was how you talked about M. Stanton Evans and how he, to me, was like a regular old country boy, who loved Hardee's. He would rather eat at Hardee's than maybe some highfalutin place. Loved rock and roll. It's someone that I think I could relate to more than, I guess, what the conservative movement has been sort of about, which is going to these high, galas and stuff like that. Maybe going to these big dinners that have,
Right.
caviar and stuff like that. And I just love that I think Stanton Evans just kind of knew who he was, and this is what he was going to be. And I just related to that a lot.
Yeah, I think it was Dan Oliver who, was the 70s, the executive editor of National Review and a significant figure in his own right. I think he described Stan to me some years ago as every man's Bill Buckley. In other words, Stan was a Phi Beta Kappa Yale graduate shortly after Buckley, in fact. And yet he was, Buckley, of course, from a wealthy family, lived on Park Avenue, hung out with Norman Mailer, etc. We know that story very well. That wasn't Stan. As you say, he liked hot dogs, big gulp from 7-Eleven, fast food. One of his favorite jokes was when he moved out to rural Virginia, is that near Leesburg, he says, well, Leesburg has a Hardee's on each end of town, and so I have variety and choices in my diet. So, he loved to make jokes like that. But, he, as the cliche goes, he scrubbed up very well. And, if you saw him at a conference or at some event, he was very sober and serious and very conventional in that sense. He was, I'll just add this, a favorite choice of just about everyone to be a master of ceremonies for, an annual dinner or something of that kind. And that's where his wit came out. He kept his wit out of his columns for the most part, which is a curious thing about him. But boy, in person, he had a very dry wit and a perfect comic delivery. I think he could have been a stand-up comic if he'd wanted to be, in a very deadpan way. And that's what people remember him for, maybe more than anything else, really, although a couple of his books have, I think, stand the test of time and will be around for a long time.
Well, since you mentioned his wit, I was going to ask this a little later in the interview, but one of the things my co-host wanted to know is, of course, Evans had one of the wittiest quotes of any conservative intellectual. In researching this book, did you gain a new appreciation for any of those kind of quotes and stuff, or did you discover anything new that you didn't hear before, or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I did compile some of his best witticisms in an appendix because people have been saying for years now that, gosh, someone ought to put together a Stan Evans joke book. So I've tried to do that. So I didn't really discover, maybe one or two witticisms somebody passed along to me that I either hadn't heard or had forgotten. But I think the real surprises were more on the substance of the man. I had never read his early journalism from the late 50s and the 1960s, when he was an editor at the Indianapolis News daily evening paper, obviously in Indiana. And there I saw that some really interesting places where he was way ahead of his time. He anticipated and described pretty clearly what today we call the problem of the administrative state, and that it was a problem not just of constitutional perfidy against the separation of powers, but also the groupthink and ideology that would come to dominate our bureaucracies. In that respect, he anticipated people like John Marini, I think, very well. Secondly, on foreign policy, he had a really interesting take on things back at the time of John F. Kennedy was running on the so-called missile gap against Richard Nixon. And although Stan was a very strong anti-communist, I'll say more about that in due course, perhaps, he thought that the liberals were making a mistake in overestimating the capabilities of the Soviet Union. And in places, if you just quoted him in isolation, you might have thought he was a leftist, because, the leftists have always said, we don't need to spend all this on defense. We should quit making the Soviet Union to be 10 feet tall and whatnot. But what Stan perceived was by overestimating actual Soviet capabilities, we would ironically be less likely to stand up to them and less likely to have a vigorous anti-communist policy. In other words, in an ironic way, it fed liberal weakness at home and in our foreign policy. And I think that was a very unusual insight, coupled with the fact that I do think that Stan kind of grew up as you might say, as a bridge to the old right of Robert Taft conservatism, which, as people know, I think, was anti-interventionist. Taft was very skeptical of NATO, and although Stan, I think, had some sympathy for that, I think he always wrestled a bit with the existential threat of the Soviet Union, which meant, you had to have a large defense budget. You had to have some alliances like NATO. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, he started going back a little bit. He was very skeptical of our invasion of Iraq, for example, although he wasn't commenting much on matters when that came along around 2003, 2004. But I really saw a very subtle approach to some of those issues. He thought the Vietnam War was likely to go wrong pretty early on, and for the reasons that it did. But he was always careful in commenting on it because he didn't want to give any aid and comfort to the anti-war left, which, it's just, a good point and a good disposition, I think. So you really saw fine mind at work. And that's one of the journalistic lessons he taught. And then I'll shut up. I'm going on too long here, but it's to entertain the counterintuitive idea. If everyone says A, you should investigate non-A, right? Because the conventional wisdom was likely defective, if not, in fact, wrong in many cases. And that's a good disposition to have, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of interesting stuff in this book, and I'm young, so some of these things about the Soviet Union, Nixon, some of this stuff was a little bit before my time, but it was an interesting thing, the kind of insights you put into his work and stuff, and it just. I was kind of wondering, were you trying to, in a way, what's the right word? Try to get to the conservative movement through Evans's eyes, the way he saw the conservative movement, and you kind of use Evans as a figure to kind of say from A to B through maybe through George Bush, of here's where the conservative movement started and here's what it is now. Like, were you trying to do that?
Not maybe primarily. Here's what I guess I'd put it this way. I thought that, well, first of all, I think we need to keep alive the memory of our heroes, and that's why I thought he deserved a biography. But second, I do think there are timeless lessons to be learned from Evans and people like him. And I just gave one about his advice to journalists to think counterintuitively about any issue that comes along. And third, that intellectual and professional example is one that hard to emulate, but worth trying anyway. So he's a role model. That's a phrase, by the way, he would have mocked if you'd ever told that to him, but because he liked to mock. He used to joke that I'm for disempowerment. He didn't like cliches, especially even cliches from conservatives. But so that's part of it. And it is true that you picked up one thing. There is a subtext here of the glory days of the conservative movement, especially in the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s, when you can see the conservative movement gathering strength intellectually and politically. And Ronald Reagan is the breakthrough. You get to the first President Bush, and Evans, who was often quite critical of the Reagan administration, although never Reagan personally. He was very careful about that. But he said he never expected much from George H.W. Bush. And so when Bush didn't deliver, he wasn't surprised. He did say some pretty harsh things about the first President Bush. So there is that sort of story arc there. And I think a lot of people these days have some nostalgia about the good old days of the conservative movement. I'll add this about intellectually is Stan was sympathetic to Frank Meyer's famous fusionism project of trying to reconcile traditional Russell Kirk conservatism with the libertarianism of Milton Friedman, although he hated the term fusionism. And that's a good clue, by the way, to his sophisticated thought. He said the problem with that label is that the premise is that two incompatible things are being forced together that don't go together naturally. And he thought just the opposite. He thought that free markets depended on virtue and virtue depended on free markets, that one would not survive without the other. So although he was a big free marketeer, he was always telling libertarians, don't suppose that you can be a moral relativist and think that government will stay small. Quite the opposite. All these liberation movements will end up with a larger state and more politicization of our social life. And boy, we see what's going on right now with things like the transgender business and education and critical race theory. He turns out to have been a prophet about exactly where we are now.
Well, that brings me to my next question, because we are friends like Glenn Elmers, who has been on this podcast and is a personal friend of mine. And I just saw recently he was on your podcast.
Right.
He written in a article called "Conservatism is No Longer Enough," and really, really pushed back hard against, the conservatism that I guess we have known for the past, decade or two. And I was wondering, what would you think Evans say to our friends like Glenn Elmers? Would he agree with them, and or would he say, stay the course? We shouldn't really be, blowing everything up.
So I think he would be very sympathetic. I guess to do the timeline for listeners, Stan died in I think the summer of 2015, which would have been, right after Trump came down the elevator in the that famous scene, right? And he'd been very ill with cancer for months before that. So, he was pretty much disengaged from things. I ask everybody who knows him, what would he have made of Trump? Because Stan was a very courtly, gentlemanly person. And a lot of people say, well, he obviously wouldn't have liked Trump's rudeness and tweeting habits and so forth. And yeah, I can see that, but I can also see that Trump did something that Stan was always saying was a weakness for Republicans. And, one person he used to like was Spiro Agnew, who's the only other person who's a bit like Trump and taking on the media directly, 50 years ago now. And that is to reject the premises of the media and the left. The single biggest mistake he thought people like Nixon made, and even the Reagan administration to some extent, was to accept the premises of the left, and then that immediately puts you on the defensive. When it comes to where we are now, which is especially in sort of the social areas of the world, it's been just one constant rout from the left for 50 years now. I think Stan would be inclined to agree with Glenn and others who say, just going back to, passing out more copies of Russell Kirk's Conservative Mind is not going to save us from the conditions we're in now and where things are headed. Stan was, although he talked in the usual accents of the conservative movement, as it was known at the time, he did once in a while, well, put it this way, when he was the editor of the Indianapolis News, which was the evening paper, and the morning paper was the Indianapolis Star, both owned by the Pulliam family, who was a very conservative Republican, Gene Pulliam. And he used to say that Indiana is blessed by having stereophonic reaction available in its papers. You got it in the morning, you got it in the evening. So, that's, he offered that as a joke, but I think he understood that sometimes a disposition to say, no, we have to roll things back is one that he had sympathy for.
So, you mentioned in one of his and earlier about him being a role model and such, and I know he would probably disregard saying he's a role model, but in your book you kind of go through, the people that he sort of influenced, and why was that so important to him to take time out of, because like you said in your book, he was sort of really a rock star. He at the height of his powers, he was doing a radio bit. He wrote a couple of columns, and then he was also, I think at that time, still part of the ACU, and other great things for the conservative movement. But he took time out of his day to bring in young conservatives and kind of brought them up, why was that so important to him?
Well, I think he had the disposition of a teacher. If I had a hunch about this, and I don't think I could have found out anything in documentary records or interviews, but my hunch about it is he had the disposition of a teacher. I'll say more about that in a second. But I think at the same time, he didn't think that conventional academic life was a very promising career for him. You might say he was impatient, but as early as age 24 or 25, when he was managing editor of Human Events in Washington, when it was just an 8-page newsletter, really, but growing fast. Even then, he took on interns and young people. And that was, in fact, he said later, that was kind of the prototype for the National Journalism Center 20 years later. And then at the American Conservative Union, he'd take on interns. So I think he understood, I think he was involved with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute in the 50s as it was founded and growing. And I think he thought in the very simple, straightforward, and sentimental way that sometimes we mock, but, youth is the future. And if we're not cultivating the youth, we are, and, young people want to get ahead in the world, that we're not doing our job right. And we're not thinking enough about the future and our successors. So that's part of it. And then I think he was just a natural at it, right? So he'd have been a great professor, but as I say, I think he didn't want to put up with the nonsense of academia, which is not just ideological, but the way it's been bureaucratized, and you got to publish a lot of nonsense and journal articles that 5 people read forever and ever. And who wants that misery? I think he wanted a bigger bang for his buck sooner.
Right. And I mean, this was in your story, but it was in your patriotism and not enough story is the radical, new left radicals kind of took over the universities at that time. And I kind of wonder, maybe he looked at that and said, I don't want any part of that. The campuses are crazy, and of course, Harry Jaffa and Walter Burns were definitely a big part of that, but,
yeah, well, I think sorry, go ahead.
No, just a thought. Maybe that's why he thought, I don't want to be a professor. Well,
that could be part of it. I think he thought, this is a curious thing. I think he thought while he was at Yale, he went there as his father's an important figure, was very conservative, but Stan was at Yale and he arrived there right after Buckley's famous book came out, God and Man at Yale. And one of the things that comes through, I think, is that he felt somewhat isolated and understood that other conservative students felt isolated. They didn't have a lot of resources. They didn't have a lot of networking. And so he did a lot of stuff at Yale to organize conservative students while he was an undergraduate. And that's why, as I say, he was a big fan of ISI. Even as a daily writer at the Indianapolis News, he would make time to go give talks on college campuses throughout the Midwest. Often, finish work at 4 or 5 o'clock, get in the car and drive somewhere, sometimes, an hour and a half away. So he had a heart for that sort of thing. His first book was actually called Revolt on the Campus. And it may seem odd now that he's thought, this is 1961, I think it came out. He had predicted that the next wave of student activism would be from the right. And of course, what most people would say is, well, boy, that got overtaken by the new left in the 60s. And that's true in terms of attention and magnitude and all the rest of that. On the other hand, the conservative youth movement of the 60s are the people who became appointees in the Reagan administration 20 years later, and leaders of the conservative movement. And so although the left gets all the ink and all the attention and all the nostalgia, it is true, as I forget which leftist, it might have been, Todd Gitlin, who just died here a couple months ago. I think he might have been the person who said the right stormed Washington, the left stormed the English department.
Yep.
Now, of course, that latter part has had consequences as we see today, but in the short run, it looked like the student movement of the right was the much more consequential one in political terms.
So, one of the other things that you talk about, which I didn't know, and is very Jaffa-esque to me, is like Jaffa, he wrote Barry Goldwater's acceptance speech. Liberty is not enough. That sort of thing. Right. But and it wasn't known for a long time that he wrote that.
Right.
And M. Stanton Evans did sort of the same thing with the Sharon statement. And that's something I did not know about. Tell us a little bit about that story and why they kind of chose him to make this statement. That is, I think, one of the most well-known statements in conservative history.
Yeah, right. I was not aware of the fact that Young Americans for Freedom, which was the Sharon Statement's founding document, that actually grew out of the boomlet for Goldwater in 1960. because Goldwater gave a famous speech at the Republican convention when somebody thought to nominate him as conservatives were mad at Nixon for being too friendly to Nelson Rockefeller. Anyway, and so it was a youth movement at the convention, and it was coming out of the convention that Bill Buckley and Marvin Liebman and a few other people said, we ought not to let this moment pass. We ought to figure out a way to harness and organize this youthful energy, and keep it going. And so that's why they called a meeting at Buckley's house in Sharon, Connecticut, and to found Young Americans for Freedom. And they said, and Stan Evans, this young, promising guy at the Indianapolis News, let's ask him to write the statement of principles for this organization. And so that was the Sharon statement. It's only I have the whole thing in the book. It's only 375 words long, something like that, not much longer than the Gettysburg Address. And you can still read it with profit today. It's all about we're for free markets, individual liberty, constitutionally limited government, vigorous foreign policy against communism. That's the one part that's maybe slightly obsolete historically. And, you can read it today with profit. And for years, if you ever asked Stan about it, he never bragged about his authorship of it. And if you did ask him about it directly, he'd say, I don't think there's anything original there. I was just summarizing in the shortest way possible traditional conservative wisdom that goes back centuries. I'm just the heir of all this, which, literally speaking is true, but still it shows the modesty of the man. But he was also called upon several other times to write statements, collective statements for conservatives. In 1971, I think it is, he wrote the Declaration of the Manhattan 12. This is almost completely forgotten now, but this was the 12 were conservative leaders who were breaking their support with Richard Nixon because of Nixon's move to the left in foreign policy and domestic policy. And Stan wrote that document, although he didn't sign it himself for some odd reasons. And then in the early 80s, he similarly wrote a critique of the Reagan administration, I think around 1982 or 83, when Reagan had agreed to a tax increase and some other things. And Stan, once again, was the guy that all the conservatives said, you write our statement. And so he was, as several people put it to me, the guy you always wanted in the room that you turned to for summarizing the wisdom of the group, and that you wanted to delegate the responsibility of writing a statement on behalf of everybody.
Yeah, I mean, and he would have been great ghostwriter, if he ever had the chance, to write a book and stuff.
He did actually. I mean, he wrote 7 or 8 or 9 books himself. He did collaborate on a book by William Simon. I didn't mention this in the book, but William Simon had this big bestseller, A Time for Truth, and then he did a sequel, which didn't sell quite as well. But Stan worked with him on the sequel, which was called A Time for Action. And then Ed Meese wrote a memoir of his time with Reagan around 1990, I'm going to say 91. And a lot of people have trouble writing memoirs when they're so close to events. And Stan essentially rewrote the book and reorganized it for General Meese. So he did do a little bit of that. He was very skilled at that too.
Yeah, because you've written in your book, like sometimes you couldn't tell what was Stan's and what was from the Indianapolis news, right, and such. And he seemed to, whether it was the Sharon statement or something else, he really seemed to do a good job of making it a collective thing, and you couldn't really tell that it was his own distinct work. Yeah. I just find that very interesting that he seemed to think of the conservative movement as a whole and forget his ego or whatever, and just really did really put pen to paper about what the conservative movement is all about. And that's very humbling. He right. Seemed like a very humbling type of guy to just that's what he was going to be about.
Yeah, he was very much a team player. And I mean, there are 2 or 3 aspects of that. One is, as you mentioned, his prose is very plain. He didn't believe in being a big stylist. And in fact, he told people he thought that the writer should get out of the way, and it's the message in the article that ought to be preeminent. So, unlike Buckley, unlike certain other columnists you can think of, he deliberately had very plain, I call it meat and potatoes prose. And then the second thing is, I say he was a team player. He tended to live by a variation of the 11th commandment, which was thou shalt not speak ill of another conservative. he almost never criticized someone else on the right in print. And even in private, he was occasionally say something sarcastic or funny about another conservative, but it usually was not harsh. It's certainly never personally harsh. And the one partial exception to this was George Will, who he disagreed with vigorously on some of Will's particular takes on, say, the American founding, for example. And I also think that he this is just a guess on my part, but I think he didn't like the fact that Will was so aloof from the conservative movement, which, by the way, Will has candidly admitted to, that he kept aloof from the conservative movement. And Stan thought, we all ought to be on this, it's one thing to have opinions, but we all ought to be on the same team. And he thought that Will was deficient in that respect. And so that annoyed him some. But as I said, that only came out in print just once that I know of. He wrote a very sharp review of Will's book, Statecraft to Soulcraft, which ironically Will himself disavowed years later. So Stan was right about that.
And so did Charles Kessler. He wrote an article for the National Review about statecraft and soulcraft, which is really, I still go back to that article.
Yes.
So two more questions. One is I wanted to get your opinion about what you think Evan would say today to the conservative movement, because he seems like he's the spokesperson, I would say, for the conservative movement. This was what he was all about, trying to further the conservative movement that much forward, and for us to be successful, for the nation to be successful. What do you think he would say today?
Yeah, so I think at least two things. One is he did kind of predict Trumpism or Trumpist populism in one way. I mean, as early as the 1960s, he was saying conservative politicians, and he thought Nixon had a little piece of this, have a great potential to appeal to the working class, as we put it today. In those days, they talked about the hard hat vote, but it meant the same thing. But at the same time, and so I think he would be very much in favor of enthusiastic and gratified to see the appeal of Republicans, at least, to working class voters who used to be lean to the Democratic side. However, he did also caution, and I think this was in the 1970s, we have to be careful not to be offering working class voters low budget liberalism. I think the phrase he actually used was Tory paternalism, which, the British Conservative Party was always sort of friendlier to the welfare state than Stan ever was. And so I think he would be very worried right now in issuing cautions about people like Orrin Cass, who I know and like, but who are saying we ought to have industrial policy to save Ohio, right? And have a steel industry. And that's where I think Stan's free market instincts, and also his clear perception that it's too easy for those kinds of programs to be captured and corrupted by the left. That you're playing on the liberals' turf if you think we're going to, offer goodies to the working class. He'd be much more in favor of deregulation, lower taxes, some very traditional things that right now are kind of out of favor with, I think, populist conservatives. And that's a long argument to be had. But as I say, he saw the potential for all this, but then also what could be the confusions that I think, and we do see these confusions today, a lot of division about exactly what a populist economic policy would look like right now.
So, and the last thing I wanted to ask, because, you've written a great book here. Are you planning to write more biographies and more books? Because I think you're right in that we have, especially my age, we do kind of not have heroes anymore. I mean, I am influenced by Jaffa and the Claremont School, and so I had the pleasure of meeting in his ideas and such. I'm less about Evans. I would love to see books about Francis Canavan or something like that, because there are figures in the conservative movement that are just forgotten. So are you planning to do more of these series, or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know. This is the first truly conventional biography I've ever done. I mean, even my Age of Reagan books were political narratives, which don't try to do a comprehensive, birth to death arc. and my book about Jaffa and Burns was intellectual biography and fairly confined. And so that's actually easier to do. Writing a conventional, old-fashioned biography is a lot harder because you do have to try and find all the gaps. And I did enjoy it, though. I have to say, I really loved writing this book. And so I'm not sure. I mean, Frank Canavan, I hadn't thought about him, but I'm thinking just aloud here. I might think about doing a book or two that's portraits of several people. So Frank Canavan, Joseph Cropsey. I don't know. I'm just going to throw out some names, but because sometimes those can be interesting books of intellectual portraits that would be a little pocket biographies, you might say, right? I have to think about that idea because I think there's some value to that.
Well, I mean, this is just my view. Between you, Glenn Elmers with his book about Jaffa, my friend David Frisk is doing a biography of Wilmore Kendall.
Right.
It seems like now will be a good time to kind of reintroduce some of these figures to younger conservatives like myself.
Right. And the left, I mean, I think the last time I checked on this, that's many years ago now, there were 3 biographies already in existence of Anita Hill. I mean, first of all, who wants to read about Anita Hill? But the left does this. So, as just a pure literary matter, we need to do more of it. Yes. Absolutely.
Well, Steve, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program. I listen to your podcast religiously with you and Lucretia. Really do enjoy listening to that and reading your wonderful blog, Powerline. Any chance I get. So our listeners, please go check out his podcast and his blog called powerlineblog.com. And again, thank you so much, Steve.
Well, thank you, Seth. It's been fun as always.